In chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah, they leave Hebron, where they've been living, and they travel south to the Negev, and then they end up settling in a place called Gerar. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us why they left Hebron after living there for so many years, or why they settled in Gerar. It could be that they moved to just new pasture lands for their flocks. Remember, Abraham had large flocks of sheep, and it was common for shepherds to move their flocks to new pastures or green pastures for their sheep to graze. It's still something that is practiced today in many parts of the Middle East. So it could be just that he was moving his flock to a different field. But this move to Gerar is significant because it's while living in Gerar that Abraham and Sarah will have their promised son, Isaac. If you remember back in chapter 18, God had promised Sarah that she would have a son and name him Isaac, and God said it will happen within the year. And so they're at a point now where in less than a year they're going to have a son. Now, verse 2 tells us that when they arrived at Gerar, Abraham told the local people that Sarah was his sister, and Abimelech, the king of Gerar — Abimelech is just a title, like Pharaoh is a title. Abimelech is a title for a king. Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, if you feel like you've heard this story before, you have. Back in Genesis chapter 12, 25 years earlier, when Abraham and Sarah journeyed down to the land of Egypt, Abraham, it says, feared for his life, and so he told the Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister, and Pharaoh took Sarah into his harem, but God intervened and protected Sarah. Now it's 25 years later. Abraham finds himself in a similar situation, and Abraham once again resorts to lying. Now, before we talk about Abraham's lying, let me just say, first of all, in Genesis 12, Abraham was afraid, we're told, because his wife was so beautiful. And in Genesis 12, Sarah was 65 years old. Now she's 90 years old. And he's still afraid because his wife is beautiful, which tells us Sarah must have been a pretty woman if at 90 Abraham is afraid because of her beauty. And he's afraid, and so once again he lies. And I want you to note here that Abraham repeats the exact same sin when he's in the exact same situation. There is a pattern in Abraham's life. There's a pattern to his sin. It hasn't changed for Abraham for 25 years. He's still the same guy he was in many ways, 25 years later, that he was when he was in Egypt. When Abraham thinks he's in a tight spot, he lies. That's his default. You could say lying was his default sin. Lying was the sin that Abraham always resorted to. Lying was the sin that ensnared Abraham. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, listen to what it says. It tells us to cast off the sins that so easily ensnare us. The sins that so easily ensnare us. The sins that we always trip over. The sins that we constantly return to. The sins that we constantly repeat. Listen, you know this. I'm not telling you anything new, but we each have sins that easily ensnare us. You know, there are certain things that just really aren't that much of a temptation for you or me, but then there are other sins that easily ensnare us. For Abraham, it was lying. That was his sin that he repeated over and over in his life. That was his default sin when he was afraid He would resort to lying. That was the sin that he naturally repeated. And for all of us, just like Abraham, we have a default sin or default sins that we always repeat, that we always do, that we always resort to. There's a pattern there. There's a pattern in your life. There's a pattern in my life, just like Abraham, where we repeat a particular sin when we're in a particular situation. And we default to a particular sin when we're afraid, like Abraham. Or maybe it's when you're alone. Or maybe when you're feeling a lot of pressure. Or maybe when you're stressed out. Or maybe when you're tired. Or when it's late at night. Or maybe when you've been drinking. Maybe, whatever it may be. Whatever it may be, whenever you're in a particular situation, or I'm in a particular situation, you react exactly the same way every time. You always fall back into the same trap. You go back to the same sin that easily ensnares you. And that's true for everybody. We all got that thing. So then what do? Well, one thing you do is you avoid being in the situation that leads to that sin. That sounds simple enough, doesn't it? You just avoid it. You just make sure you're never in that situation. And you recognize the pattern in your life. You know what? Whenever I'm in this situation, I tend to do this. I know for me, not so much in 2020, because it's been such a crazy year, but, my wife recognized that when I would come home from work, I needed about 30 minutes by myself before I could really interact with the family or interact with the kids or deal with kids. If on occasion when the kids met me at the door or met me in the driveway with something, I just instantly was stressed out by it, and I would respond in frustration and anger. And so my wife, in her great wisdom, would just kind of let me do my own thing for the first 15, 20, 30 minutes when I got home, to just kind of whatever I needed to do to readjust. Now I'm home, and then I could kind of, wade into the water of being back at home or whatever. There's a pattern there. Recognizing that pattern. Now I'm going to make an adjustment so I don't fall into that trap, right? And we have this pattern in our lives that we can recognize and just make adjustments so that we avoid that situation. Another thing we can do is allow God to transform our minds and transform our thinking. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32 says, "Let the Spirit of God renew your thoughts and attitude." The Spirit of God can renew your mind. And so to keep us from falling into that same old sin that we fall into, we can change the situation, avoid the situation, and then we can allow God to change us and renew our mind. Abraham hasn't done that. And so for 25 years now, it's the same old pattern in his life when he's in this situation. So Abimelech the king takes Sarah. Verse 3 says, "But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'Indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife.'" Now, God has never appeared to me in a dream, but if he does, I hope his first words to me are not, "You're a dead man," right? If I ever see God appear in my room while I'm sleeping, I hope that's not what he says. It doesn't sound much like a dream. That sounds more like a nightmare to me. But God intervenes in this situation to keep his plan for Abraham and Sarah on track. As I said, this is within a year of the birth of Isaac. Sarah may even be pregnant at this point with Isaac. If she's not pregnant now, she will be soon. And Abraham's sin is potentially veering things off course for him and Sarah and their promised son. And so God now steps in.